On June 25, 2020, a German court ruled in favor of the National Council of Resistance of Iran in a case challenging the content of Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung FAZ article purporting to describe the situation of PMOI-MEK members in Ashraf 3 in Albania, which houses members of the People's Mojahedin Organization of Iran, PMOI-MEK. Both the compound, Ashraf 3 and MEK have been targets of extensive disinformation campaigns by the Iranian regime. The same court ordered a similar case for another news publication, Der Spiegel, in March 2019. That publication, too, published an article that conveyed similar allegations against the MEK in general and Ashraf 3 in Albania in particular. Both Der Spiegel and FAZ provide a platform for individuals who presented themselves as former MEK members and portrayed themselves as having fled their Albanian residence in wake of mistreatment at the hands of MEK leadership in Albania. But the NCRI's legal challenge identified the originators of these allegations as operatives for, or collaborators with, Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security, MOIS. In the past 2 years, similar allegations from the same sources have been published in Britain's Channel 4, Al Jazeera English, BBC, and the New York Times.
The humiliation of Der Spiegel, one of the world's great publications, citing information patently false, directly from Tehran, and having to be ordered by a German court to remove it. And I'm embarrassed to tell you, the same would have happened with the New York Times, but for the fact that our laws and constitution are different and the courts cannot as readily undertake such action. These regimes will use means to manipulate you and get false stories in print. It is happening again and again, not simply to the embarrassment of Der Spiegel, the New York Times, their own humiliations. That's not the price. The price is that it prevents the proper international coalition of individuals, gathering of thoughts, building of momentum, pressure on the regime. In the end, it means lives. It means lost time and the freedom of the Iranian people. Please, please exercise the highest standards and real caution.
This has been an organized campaign by the Iranian regime to demonize and discredit the MEK. But why?
With the economic situation deteriorating at home, corruption rampant, street protests continue to break out in Iran itself. They do so despite the real risk of death for the protesters and despite the disinformation campaigns that the regime wages against its opponents, including most frequently against this organization.
While the Iranian regime's constantly been engaging in spreading misinformation about the Iranian opposition, these efforts took on a new scale as popular protests began emerging across Iran at the end of 2017, in which were chanted MEK slogans such as, "Death to the dictator." These slogans gained popular support in Iran despite the regime's disinformation campaign against MEK and NCRI. The regime change message of the 2018 uprising reflected the MEK's platform, while its spontaneous spread reflected a high level of organization that is only possible in the presence of a well-developed network of MEK activists. This is what the regime fears most and why it goes to great lengths to distract people from joining the resistance.
Those that are uniting all protesters inside Iran and gathering international support outside its borders, those are for both of them the real enemy, namely the NCRI and especially the MEK have been their common targets because they can see how people in Iran are recognizing their leadership as a unifying, organized force to defeat the regime and open finally the way to democracy. For years, the mullah's regime has campaigned to portray the MEK as a terrorist organization, and it has failed. They all have failed. Every single time when their accusations have been brought to a court of justice, an independent judge has made a point of honor, be it in the States, in Britain, in Europe, to clean the name of the Iranian resistance and of its leaders from all the dirt the regime tried to pile up against them. Today, they want to divide protesters inside Iran and within the resistance with the weird allegation that the MEK people in Ashraf are prisoners of their leaders, unable to make their own decisions. This is precisely what the tyrannic regime of the mullahs is guilty of. The regime holds Iranian population as its prisoners, trying to brainwash them with lies and threats, and even using the name of God to do evil. That is the reason for millions of Iranians to be protesting as we speak, inside Iran and abroad. It's a well-known strategy to accuse your accusers of what you're guilty of, turning tables, putting the blame on the other.
In January 2018, the regime's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, publicly accused the MEK of planning and facilitating the 2018 uprising.
از ماه‌ها قبل اینا آماده بودن. خود رسانه‌های منافقین اعتراف کردند در همین روزها از چند ماه قبل نسبت به این قضیه که پادویی کنن، سازماندهی کنن، برن این اونه ببینن، کسانی رو در داخل نشان کنن، پیدا کنن که بهشون کمک کنن تا بیان به مردم فراخوان بدن. فراخوان رو اونا دادن. یه عده‌ای رو جذب کنن، بعد بیان خودشون وسط اهداف شوم خودشون رو دنبال کنن، مردم رو هم دنبال خودشون بکشن. هدف این بود.
That in turn set the stage for another nationwide protest in November 2019, which once again showcased MEK leadership and explicit calls for regime change.
And you know, to me, obviously the MEK has done a great deal for the people of Iran and for the world. But perhaps the greatest testimony to your effectiveness is the fact that the Iranian regime hates you so much and will stop at nothing to destroy you. And to me, that speaks volumes. It says that they consider you a threat.
Having no way out of crisis, the Iranian regime sees no other way out of its current dilemma than engaging in a reprehensible campaign of demonization of the MEK. The goals are, number one, discrediting a viable alternative to the ruling theocracy that has succeeded both in organizing protests within Iran and in disrupting the Iranian regime's terrorist activities and destructive policies. Number two, preparing the ground for terrorist attacks justified by such propaganda.
In the West, where I am sitting, news reports are saying the same old, false, discredited things about the MEK. Why are they doing this? The resistance has consistently advocated free elections since the 1979 revolution. Mrs. Rajavi has never failed, from what I have heard, to point out that the NCRI's goal is to give sovereignty back to the people of Iran, not to seize power themselves. Is there any other resistance group advocating universal democratic values in Iran? Is there any other resistance group standing for gender equality against a brutal and corrupt regime 100% controlled by men? Is there any other resistance group that is capable of organizing a worldwide virtual meeting with thousands of people in over 100 countries? You'll recognize that picture. It's a remarkable sight. The world has never seen anything like that. The regime sees these events, and they know the NCRI and the MEK, more than anyone else, are fully capable of organizing a democratic transition to legitimate constitutional government after the fall of the regime. Western media and think tank reports still repeat the allegations that were entirely debunked officially by court challenges in France, the European Union, the UK, and the United States years ago. Why do they keep repeating these allegations, these falsehoods? My conclusion is the same. No matter what the regime does, the reason is the same. Why are they seeking to discredit the NCRI and the MEK? Why did they rush to defend Bashar al-Assad's regime in 2011 against the Syrian people? Why did they enter into a long negotiation with Europe and the United States and the P5+1 to try to talk about nuclear weapons, to keep the US and Europe from acting against the regime? The reason is always the same reason: to keep a weak, illegitimate regime in power.
Now, the MEK and your efforts have been instrumental in exposing this conspiracy of terror by the government of Tehran over many, many years. And you've had, I think, some very important successes in disrupting the Iranian regime's terrorist activities. And that's why, again, not only have they tried to destroy you in Iran, they've also tried to discredit and demonize you outside of Iran. They have funded information campaigns against you. They have tried to convince journalists, governments, think tanks that the MEK is an outlaw organization, that it doesn't represent Iranians, that it has no following inside Iran. Well, again, the fact that they're saying this indicates to me that the opposite is true. Otherwise, they wouldn't be spending all this money and effort to present a false narrative.
The flip side of this coin is the forced televised confessions of prisoners to discredit the resistance against the regime. The Associated Press, in a report published on June 25, 2020, wrote, "State television has broadcast the suspected coerced confessions of at least 355 people over the last decade as a means to both suppress dissent and frighten activists in the Islamic Republic on behalf of security services."
My friends, 9 years ago, I felt that Americans who've met with the NCRI and the MEK and who spoke at their events faced a lot of pressure and a lot of criticism. The group was on terrorism lists around the world. Today, I believe the tables have turned. As we say in America, the shoe is on the other foot. The Iranian diplomat, Asadollah Assadi, is facing charges of terrorism in a Belgian court. His plot to bomb the NCRI rally in Villepinte in 2018 involved Iranian embassies in several countries. How many journalists have asked Foreign Minister Zarif to explain why he is using diplomatic privileges to support terrorism? Why authorities in Denmark, France, Belgium, Germany, Austria, and Albania have all encountered state-sponsored Iranian terror activity on their soil in the past 2 years. And for those who may not be aware, I have said this many times, no member of the MEK or NCRI has ever been prosecuted and convicted of terrorism in a democratic country with an independent judiciary observing the rule of law. So now, when I read Western news reports of Friday's virtual rally and the Twitter criticisms that tried to prevent anyone from mentioning the resistance, it is the reporters and the analysts whose motives must now be questioned. Are they on Tehran's payroll? Are their relatives being threatened back home? Are they agents of the regime following the 80-20 tactic? I'm sure you know what the 80-20 tactic is. You should criticize the regime 80% of the time, but make sure that 20% you criticize the NCRI and MEK so it looks more authentic and credible. Yes, It's a different world, ladies and gentlemen. I know what the facts are. The NCRI's critics are trapped in a web of propaganda and falsehoods.
In a nutshell, terrified of the enthusiasm exhibited by young people towards the MEK and the cause of regime change and international support for the resistance, the regime desperately needs to either eliminate or isolate the democratic resistance movement by fake news and demonizing campaign.
We must support the democratic opposition, the NCRI, the MEK, and most important, the brave resistance units inside Iran. We must also continue to fight against the false narratives surrounding the MEK that have become deeply ingrained given the regime's massive and sustained disinformation campaign, served by an echo chamber of regime apologists who often masquerade as journalists and think tank experts.